30 years, 30 long, invisible years. That is how long I walked this earth feeling as though I were lost inside my own life. I am 100 years old now, and when a man has lived this long, he learns to speak plainly. So let me get straight to the point. If you are exhausted all the time, not just in your body, but deep in your spirit, then you are not tired from work. You are tired from fighting battles that do not exist. My name is William. I have buried friends, watched entire industries rise and collapse, and held my grandchildren's children in my arms. But the hardest war I ever fought was not with poverty, not with competitors, not even with sickness. It was with ghosts I carried inside my own mind. For 3 decades of my adult life, I believed the world was against me. I believed I had to stay alert, defensive, ready to strike before I was struck. That belief cost me more than any financial mistake ever could. In my 40s and 50s, I became what society would call a successful man. I wore tailored suits. I had an office high above the city, my name engraved in polished brass. From the outside, I looked like a man who had conquered life, but inside I was constantly bracing for impact. A short message from my boss felt like a hidden threat. Silence at the dinner table felt like judgment. Even small inconveniences on the road could ignite a storm in my chest. I was living as if danger followed me everywhere. It took me decades to understand the brutal truth. When you react to the present with overwhelming fear or anger, you are rarely reacting to what is actually happening. You are reacting to something much older, something unfinished. Somewhere deep within you lives a younger version of yourself who once felt powerless, rejected, or unseen. That frightened child does not understand promotions or mortgages or adult responsibilities. He only understands survival. And if you do not learn to calm him, he will drive your decisions long after you believe you have grown up. I remember being 10 years old, watching my father return from the factory with hands cracked and shoulders bent. I remember how easily the world dismissed him. In that moment, a silent vow formed inside me. Never be weak, never be overlooked, never be the one who is stepped on. It sounded like strength. In reality, it became a prison. 40 years later, when my wife simply asked me an ordinary question, I did not hear her voice. I heard the echo of a lifetime of insecurity, and I reacted as if I were still that boy trying to defend his dignity. If you are listening to me now, understand this early. The greatest conflicts in your life will not come from enemies outside your door. They will come from unhealed wounds you carry within it. Until you face them, you will keep mistaking sparks for explosions and shadows for threats, and the years will slip quietly through your hands while you are busy fighting air. Let me explain something that took me more than half a lifetime to truly understand. When you walk through the world convinced that everyone is judging you, opposing you, or waiting for you to fail, you are not seeing reality. You are seeing a projection. You are looking at life through a lens shaped by old pain. And the cruel irony is that the harder you try to protect yourself from imagined threats, the more damage you end up causing to the very things you claim to value. In my case, that damage showed up slowly at first. It did not arrive as a dramatic collapse or a single catastrophic event. It came in small daily fractures. A sharp tone in my voice when my wife tried to talk to me about something simple. A dismissive wave of my hand when my son wanted to show me a drawing he had spent hours working on. A sigh of irritation when my daughter asked me to attend a school performance that I considered a waste of time. Each of those moments felt insignificant at the time. I was busy. I was tired. I was carrying the weight of responsibility. That is what I told myself. But responsibility, I learned, can easily become a disguise for emotional avoidance. You can work 80 hours a week and still be running from yourself. You can provide financially for a family and still leave them starving for your presence. I convinced myself that love could be measured in square footage and tuition fees. I believed security meant building higher walls, earning more titles, collecting more proof that I mattered. What I did not realize was that my children were not measuring my worth in those terms. They were measuring it in eye contact, in laughter at the dinner table, in whether their father seemed safe to approach or permanently preoccupied. Children are extraordinarily sensitive to emotional climates. They do not need you to explain your stress for them to feel it. They absorb it through silence, through tension in your shoulders, through the way you respond when they make mistakes. If you carry constant anxiety, they will learn to live in anxiety. If you carry anger, they will learn that love feels unpredictable. And if you carry an unspoken belief that the world is hostile, they will inherit that belief long before they understand its origin. There is a metaphor I wish someone had given me when I was young. Think of your emotional life as a house filled with stored energy. Every unresolved hurt, every humiliation you never processed, every fear you refuse to name is like stacking dry wood in a dark room. For years you may walk past those piles pretending they are not there. You may even forget how much you have accumulated. Then one day a small spark appears. A minor disagreement, a delayed response, a harmless joke. Suddenly, the entire room ignites, flames everywhere, smoke choking the air, and in the chaos you point at the person who lit the match and say, "This is your fault." But the truth is more uncomfortable. The match only mattered because of the fuel you had been storing. The intensity of your reaction was never about the present moment. It was about the backlog of unacknowledged emotion. Until you begin to clear that room, until you take responsibility for what you are carrying, life will continue to feel like a series of unpredictable explosions. I spent years blaming circumstances. I blamed demanding bosses, unstable markets, the pressure of competition. I blamed my upbringing, my lack of privilege, even the personality of people around me. What I did not do was sit quietly with myself and ask the most frightening question of all. What part of this suffering am I actively maintaining? That question is terrifying because it shifts the narrative. It removes the comfort of victimhood. It suggests that while you may not be responsible for the wounds you received, you are responsible for whether they continue to control you. There came a moment late one night in my early 60s when the illusion finally began to crack. I had just finished reviewing documents for a deal that was supposed to secure my legacy. The house was silent. My wife had already gone to bed. My children were grown and living their own lives. I remember sitting alone at the kitchen table, surrounded by papers that represented decades of ambition, and feeling absolutely nothing. No pride, no excitement, just a hollow fatigue that seemed to stretch back through time. It was in that stillness that I heard the voice in my head most clearly. You know the voice I am talking about, the relentless commentator, the one that evaluates every move you make and rarely offers kindness. For years, I believed that voice was my ally. I thought it kept me sharp, disciplined, driven. I told myself that self criticism was the price of excellence. But sitting there that night, I realized something devastating. That voice had not made me strong. It had made me afraid. Afraid to fail, afraid to rest, afraid to be seen as anything less than exceptional. Psychologically speaking, the inner critic often develops as a protective mechanism. When you grow up in environments where approval feels conditional, you learn to anticipate rejection. To prevent it, part of your mind becomes hypervigilant, constantly scanning for flaws in your behavior. The intention is survival. If you correct yourself before others can criticize you, perhaps you can avoid humiliation. The strategy works temporarily. It may even lead to achievement. But over time, it creates a nervous system that never truly relaxes. Imagine living with an internal supervisor who never clocks out, someone who stands behind you not only during work hours, but in moments of leisure, in conversations with loved ones, even in the quiet before sleep. Every action is evaluated, every imperfection is magnified. Under such conditions, success does not bring satisfaction. It only raises the bar for the next performance. You become trapped in a cycle where your sense of worth is always contingent on future outcomes. At 63, I began experimenting with a radical idea. Instead of trying to silence that voice through distraction or exhaustion, I decided to engage with it consciously. I would sit in a chair, close my eyes, and observe the stream of criticism without immediately reacting. At first, this felt unbearable. It was like turning up the volume on a radio station that had always been playing faintly in the background. But with time, something shifted. I started to recognize patterns. The voice was repetitive, predictable. It recycled the same fears in different costumes. Once I saw that, its authority began to diminish. I realized that thoughts are not commands. They are mental events, signals shaped by past experiences, not necessarily accurate reflections of present reality. This distinction may sound simple, but it is transformative. When you understand that you can witness your thoughts rather than obey them, you reclaim a degree of freedom that many people never discover. Of course, insight alone does not immediately repair damaged relationships. By the time I began this inner work, my family had already adapted to a version of me that was tense, impatient, emotionally distant. Trust, once eroded, does not return overnight. I had to learn the humility of apology. I had to accept that some wounds I had caused would leave permanent scars. That realization hurt deeply. There is a unique sorrow in recognizing that the very people you worked so hard to provide for also suffered because of the way you carried your own unresolved pain. If you are younger than I was when these realizations arrived, you have an extraordinary advantage. You still have time to interrupt destructive patterns before they calcify into personality traits. You still have opportunities to show up differently in daily interactions. Change, in practical terms, often begins with small behavioral experiments. For instance, noticing the moment you feel defensive in a conversation and choosing to pause rather than escalate, or recognizing the impulse to withdraw emotionally and instead asking a sincere question about the other person's experience. These adjustments may seem minor, but they accumulate. Over months and years, they reshape the emotional atmosphere around you. People begin to feel safer. Communication becomes less adversarial. Your own nervous system learns that connection does not always lead to danger. From a neurobiological perspective, you are literally training new pathways. You are teaching your brain that cooperation can coexist with self-respect, that vulnerability does not automatically result in exploitation. One of the most profound shifts for me involved redefining what strength actually means. In my youth, strength was synonymous with control. Control over outcomes, over finances, over the impressions others formed about me. Later, I discovered that real strength often looks like openness, the willingness to admit uncertainty, the courage to express affection without calculating how it might be perceived, the discipline to rest when your body signals exhaustion instead of overriding it in pursuit of external validation. This redefinition did not make me less effective in practical terms. On the contrary, it enhanced my clarity. When you are not constantly reacting to perceived threats, your cognitive resources become available for creative problem solving. Decisions are less contaminated by ego. You can distinguish between situations that genuinely require assertiveness and those that simply trigger old insecurities. In organizational settings, this translates into more sustainable leadership. Teams respond better to stability than to volatility. Yet perhaps the most meaningful impact of this inner transformation was relational. As I softened my defensive posture, conversations with my wife began to change. There were fewer arguments fueled by misinterpretation, more moments of shared humor, more evenings where we sat quietly together without the heavy atmosphere of unresolved tension. With my children, reconciliation unfolded gradually. It involved listening to their memories of growing up with a father who was physically present but emotionally preoccupied. Hearing their pain without rushing to justify myself was one of the hardest tasks I have ever undertaken. It was also one of the most healing. If I could compress all these decades of trial and error into a single piece of advice, it would be this: examine the narratives you carry about the world and about yourself. Question whether they are still serving you. The mind has a tendency to generalize from early experiences, constructing sweeping conclusions such as people cannot be trusted or I must prove my worth constantly. These beliefs can operate beneath conscious awareness, shaping reactions automatically. Bringing them into the light of reflection is the first step toward loosening their grip. You do not need to wait for a crisis to begin this process. You can start in ordinary moments. Notice how you interpret a colleague's neutral comment. Observe the stories you tell yourself when someone does not respond to a message immediately. Pay attention to the physical sensations that accompany stress, the tightening jaw, the shallow breath, the racing thoughts. These signals are invitations to pause, to investigate rather than react. Over time, this practice cultivates psychological flexibility, a quality strongly associated with well-being across the lifespan. At 100 years old, I no longer measure success in promotions or accolades. I measure it in the depth of my relationships, in the steadiness of my mind, in the capacity to sit with life as it unfolds without constantly bracing for catastrophe. The external world will always contain uncertainty. Markets fluctuate, health changes, people come and go. What determines the quality of your experience is less about controlling these variables and more about how skillfully you relate to your own inner landscape. If you take nothing else from my story, remember this: you are not condemned to repeat emotional patterns indefinitely. The brain remains adaptable far longer than most of us assume. With deliberate attention and compassionate honesty, you can dismantle the structures of fear that once seemed permanent. And when you do, the energy that was previously consumed by internal battles becomes available for presence, for creativity, for genuine enjoyment of the fleeting years you are given. There is something else I wish someone had explained to me before my hair turned gray and my hands began to tremble slightly when I poured my morning tea. It is the quiet cost of emotional avoidance, not the dramatic cost you can see on paper or in photographs, but the subtle erosion of joy that happens when you spend years trying to outrun your own inner life. For a long time, I believed that if I just stayed busy enough, I would never have to face the uncomfortable questions. So I filled my calendar. Meetings, travel, negotiations, endless goals that moved like mirages the closer I got to them. Achievement became a form of anesthesia. Every victory dulled the anxiety for a little while, but the relief never lasted. Soon there was another mountain to climb, another standard to meet, another fear whispering that everything I had built could vanish overnight. When you live this way, your nervous system never truly rests, even in moments that should feel peaceful: a quiet Sunday afternoon, a vacation by the sea, a simple dinner with family. Part of you remains on alert. It is as if your mind is constantly scanning the horizon for signs of threat. This chronic vigilance slowly reshapes your personality. You become less patient, less curious, less able to appreciate the ordinary beauty of being alive. And because the change is gradual, you may not notice it happening. By my late 70s, I began to understand that the greatest luxury in life is not financial security. It is psychological safety within your own body. The ability to sit in silence without being ambushed by self-criticism. The ability to experience uncertainty without spiraling into catastrophic thinking. These capacities do not arrive automatically with age or success. They must be cultivated intentionally, like a garden that requires regular care. One practice that helped me profoundly was learning to differentiate between pain and suffering. Pain is inevitable. It is part of being human. You will lose people you love. You will make mistakes that cannot be undone. You will encounter periods of illness or disappointment. Suffering, however, is often amplified by the stories you attach to those events. When something painful happens, The mind tends to create narratives. This always happens to me. I am fundamentally flawed. There is no point in trying again. These interpretations prolong distress long after the original event has passed. I remember the day my business partner betrayed my trust in a way that had serious financial consequences. The initial shock and anger were natural responses, but what extended my misery for years was not the betrayal itself. It was the meaning I assigned to it. I concluded that I was foolish, that I could never rely on anyone, that vulnerability was a liability. Those conclusions hardened into defensive habits that affected every subsequent relationship. In hindsight, I see that the event was painful, but the identity I constructed around it created unnecessary suffering. Another lesson emerged from observing how time alters perspective. When you are young, setbacks feel permanent. A failed relationship, a lost opportunity, a public embarrassment. These experiences can seem like defining chapters that will shape the rest of your life. Yet as decades accumulate, you begin to notice how many of those once devastating moments fade into context. They become part of a larger narrative, sometimes even sources of unexpected wisdom. The danger lies in overreacting to temporary storms, as if they were final verdicts on your worth or your future. This is why emotional regulation is not merely a psychological skill. It is a form of long-term strategy. The calmer you can remain in the face of immediate challenges, the more accurately you can assess their true significance. Reactivity narrows perception. It pushes you toward impulsive decisions that you may later regret. Reflection, on the other hand, expands options. It allows you to respond rather than simply react. Over the span of 30 or 40 years, this difference compounds dramatically. I also learned that forgiveness is often misunderstood. People assume it is about excusing harmful behavior or pretending that injustice did not occur. In reality, forgiveness is primarily about releasing yourself from the corrosive effects of sustained resentment. When you carry grudges for decades, you are effectively allowing past events to occupy valuable mental space in the present. You replay conversations, imagine alternative outcomes, rehearse arguments that will never be resolved. This mental occupation drains energy that could otherwise be invested in constructive pursuits. In my 90s, I made a deliberate effort to revisit certain memories that still triggered bitterness. Instead of suppressing them, I examined them with curiosity. I asked myself what I had learned, how those experiences had influenced my choices, and whether holding on to anger continued to serve any meaningful purpose. Gradually, the emotional charge diminished, not because I denied the reality of what had happened, but because I recognized that my remaining years were too precious to be dominated by old grievances. If you are listening to me now, perhaps somewhere in the middle of your own life, consider this an invitation to conduct a gentle audit of your inner world. Notice which thoughts recur most frequently. Notice which situations provoke disproportionate reactions. Notice how often you postpone happiness until some external condition is met. A promotion, a relationship milestone, a financial target. There is a subtle trap in believing that peace is something you will earn later. In my experience, peace is something you practice now, imperfectly, amid the unfinished business of everyday living. Finally, understand that personal transformation is rarely a single dramatic breakthrough. It is usually a series of small, consistent adjustments. Choosing to listen more attentively in a conversation, choosing to rest when your body signals fatigue instead of overriding it, choosing to question catastrophic assumptions rather than accepting them as facts. Over years, these choices accumulate into a different way of inhabiting your life. At 100 years old, I cannot change the decades behind me, but I can testify that it is possible to arrive at a place of greater clarity and kindness toward oneself. If my story spares you even a fraction of the confusion and unnecessary struggle I endured, then speaking these words will have been worthwhile. So here I am now, 100 years old, sitting in a quiet room with more memories than tomorrow's. When you live this long, the noise of the world begins to fade, and what remains are the simple truths you once overlooked. You realize that life was never really about winning the endless arguments inside your head. It was never about proving your worth to people who were too busy fighting their own invisible battles to judge you as harshly as you imagined. If I could reach back through time and place a hand on the shoulder of my younger self, I would not give him business advice or investment tips. I would tell him to slow down, to breathe before reacting, to question the stories his fear was telling him. Most of all, I would tell him that peace is not something waiting at the finish line of achievement. It is something you must learn to carry with you while you are still running. You see, the tragedy of my life was not that I failed. The tragedy was that I often succeeded while feeling miserable. I climbed mountains with a storm in my chest. I stood in rooms full of applause, yet felt strangely alone. And now, looking back across the long landscape of years, I understand that happiness was never hiding from me. I was the one who kept postponing it, convincing myself that I would allow joy only after I had secured absolute safety, absolute certainty, absolute control. None of those things ever truly arrived. What did arrive eventually was perspective. The realization that love expressed imperfectly is still more valuable than love withheld in the name of ambition. That an evening spent listening to someone you care about is not time lost, but life gained. That the voice in your head does not have to be a tyrant if you learn to treat it with patience instead of fear. If you remember anything from these words, let it be this. Do not wait until your hair is white and your steps are slow to make peace with yourself. Do not sacrifice decades of presence chasing a future that will never feel complete. The battles you refuse to resolve within will follow you into every success you achieve. Take care of your inner world now. Be gentle where you were taught to be harsh. Be honest where you were taught to pretend. And when the years pass, as they surely will, you may find yourself, as I have, sitting in the quiet not with regret, but with a deep and steady gratitude for the life you truly allowed yourself to live.